Welcome, everyone, to another CTC Software webinar. My name is Sean Zerbis. I'm the Director of Development here at CTC Software, and today we're going to be continuing the Nexus CMS Admin Learning Series, focusing on the part of the CMS where we're going to be creating library definitions. Now, as always, of course, these webinars are recorded, and you are encouraged to take a look at these up on our YouTube channel. If you're viewing this on YouTube, we hope that you find this valuable and maybe it earns a like and a subscribe from you for our future webinars that we'll be uploading. But for those of you who are participating with us live, we keep an eye on the questions window in the webinar system here. And so we encourage you to throw questions about today's topic in there, and we try to answer them in line with our presentation, but we also save a large QA session for the end. That's not a part of the recording that gets put up online. Without further ado, let's talk in detail about what today's topic kind of is about. So it's entirely possible that you've been using the CMS for a little while in the light mode, just looking at some of the public libraries. And maybe you've just recently purchased it, and now it's time for you to start building your own internal custom libraries within this Nexus environment. Libraries really are the key to everything about how you organize and control access to your content. And so we want to make sure that you have the best possible experience and that your users have the best possible experience. And so in this session, that's what we're talking about. Everything about the management and creation and control and everything about libraries and their administration. That's the focus today. We're going to go over a couple of specific topics. First of all, what is a library? Why does it matter? We're going to talk a little bit about a plan for how to organize your libraries, at least early on, and this is going to evolve for you over time, but this is just kind of the core. We'll be digging into building some custom libraries so you can actually see how this process works. And then finally, we're going to talk about controlling user access to these custom libraries. First up, what is a library in the CMS? And to talk about this, I'm actually going to open up the Nexus CMS, and we're going to take a look at it and how it sort of navigates for searchability. Now, on the main page of the CMS, of course, there's different tiles here that we can use. One of them is libraries. Similarly, if you go into search and you go into filters and you pin it open, something that you probably would know about already because you probably went through the entire user learning series of the Nexus suite, the Nexus user learning series up on our YouTube channel. But here, if you pin this open, the very first filter option is libraries. And this is the topmost level of how you in your organization are going to organize your content. Now, one thing I don't want you to think of these libraries as is Windows folder structure. This is not meant to be Windows folder structure. It's basically just a bucket to hold content, typically by product, but we can talk about some other techniques here as well. So if I was to go into, say, my Revit content here and hit apply, what you'd probably expect to see within my search results is, well, Revit content, right? That's kind of the expectation. And if I go here to my AutoCAD Civil 3D out-of-the-box content instead and hit apply, what you'd expect to see there is generally AutoCAD content, and probably stuff that's out of the box, right? So if I was to go to Dynamo, you'd expect to see Dynamo content. And if I went to templates, you'd expect to see general corporate templates. And so these libraries, this high-level stuff, is kind of buckets by design app so that you can organize your content into discrete locations. But it's also used to control end user rights to what they can see and what they can't see. See, for my Revit design team, they probably only need Revit-centric content and maybe some Dynamo content. They probably don't need to see my AutoCAD Civil 3D content if they're only ever working in Revit. And so I can actually permission the visibility of these libraries so that people not using AutoCAD don't even see the AutoCAD libraries. And so what are libraries? Well, it's filtration, yes, but it's also rights. The other thing that I can do here is within some of these libraries, I can control how users interact with what they can see. So like the standards and procedures library here that I have, I don't really want my designers commenting on stuff that's in there. See, normally you can right-click and you can go into the detail of a piece of content, and you can write a review on that content on most design app stuff. But in my environment, within my standards and procedures library, I don't really want users writing reviews on my standards. That's not something that I kind of want. So I've permissioned it accordingly, and we'll see where you do this in a moment. So what exactly is a library? It's a bucket for content, but also permissions to how users interact with that bucket of content. That's what a library is. So let's talk a little bit about the organization. And I already touched on this lightly, but I want to retouch on it. I recommend when you first start out that you create your libraries based on the design app that will be consuming that content. So in my case, I've got Revit content, or I have Dynamo, or I have AutoCAD. Now, sometimes you might subdivide these libraries a bit and have very discrete portions of it. Like in this one here, I have AutoCAD specifically details. Doesn't really matter which portion of AutoCAD is consuming this. It's all details that's going to be in this library, fully assembled, detail drawings. So that's what's in this particular library. The name kind of helps me identify that. Things that are in this upper library, like my AutoCAD Civil 3D content that's owned by me here at CTC Express Tools, the little sub-organization that I use for demos like this. The things that I would expect to see in here is, well, Civil 3D centric content. And specifically my stuff, separate from, in this case, there's one that is the out-of-the-box content right there. The OOTB library is out-of-the-box Civil 3D content. And so I discreetly separate those so I can clearly see what is mine versus what's out of the box. Those might be some strategies that you use when you're organizing your libraries. I've also seen some companies, say in the Revit space, have Revit content for their organization, but for a specific office. Maybe there's like an Atlanta office, or there's a Paris office, or there's a New York City office, and each of those offices kind of have some specialized content that is their own. You may have Revit content New York for your organization, Revit content Paris for your organization. And so you can leverage those buckets to kind of have siloed content. Or you might go by division. Maybe you have architecture separate from MEP, or architecture separate from structure, and to subdivide some of that content so that you don't have architectural walls and structural walls mixing side by side. You might make that choice to put them into two discrete library buckets by discipline. So those are some things that you can consider when you're kind of planning out your library organization. When you start, though, first thing out the gate is start simple. Just do the design app, Revit content, AutoCAD, right? Just that. Dynamo, just that. And then maybe a couple of others like standards, procedures, and templates, and just keep it super simple so that the end users don't have to go through a huge long list of a ton of different libraries that might be available for them. Keep it simple up front. You can always make it more complex or more separated later on as needed. So we talked about what is a library. We talked a little bit about how to plan out a little bit about libraries, but how do you actually create these custom libraries? How do you do that step? Well, let's go into the portal and actually find out how this is done. So I'm actually going to go to the home page of CTC Software so we can all start here together. So ctcsoftware.com. And over here to the right, where the little logon profile is, if you're not signed in and this isn't solid filled in blue, then click on the person and go through the login process using your admin credentials. So just go ahead and sign in. In my case, I'm already signed in, so I'm just going to click the person and it takes me directly to the portal. So I have all of the portal controls because I'm an org admin. I have full access to everything in here, but if you are a CMS admin or a CMS library admin or an org admin, you should have this CMS tab, and this is where we're going to be focusing our efforts today, very specifically right here in libraries. And what you'll see is that for the most part, the list of libraries that I have here is the same list that I have in the CMS, and that's because I'm an org admin and I've got full control over everything. There's one other library that I was subscribed to. That's access to the subscription libraries, but for my private components here, they're all sitting in this list. So if you don't have anything here, or you're looking to make a new library, how do you go about doing that step? Well, go here to the upper right corner. This is a theme that you'll see across the entirety of our portal. Anytime you're doing any kind of adding or deleting of things, it's probably going to be in a little toolbar up here to the upper right. We'll see deleting here in a moment. But I'm going to go ahead and create a brand new library by hitting that plus sign. When you click that plus sign, the one thing that is required is the name. You have to give this library a name. This is what is seen by the end users when they're navigating, if they can see it in the first place. And so I'm going to give this some kind of a name. Maybe I wanted to create, say, a Revit library for the purpose of my architecture team. And I want that to be separate from my MEP team. So what I might do is create a Revit content library. I'm going to intentionally here separate this to architecture, and I want to suffix this on purpose with CTCE, my little suffix that I use for my little temporary testing account here, so I can identify it separately from other libraries owned by other organizations that I might see in that same list. You can give your library a description if you need to, and you can choose whether or not this library caches its content to the cloud. Now, we can talk about other settings. We actually did a full what are CMS settings and what defaults are available. The upload content is available because my organization setting says I can do it, but you can take a discrete library and say, nope, don't do it. And that might be important because maybe you're making a Revit content library here that is for, say, Department of Defense or something. And so this is their content. It's kind of owned by them, but I'm just putting it into my library so I can more easily consume it while I'm doing projects. But maybe I don't want that content to be hosted in the cloud. I can choose to not put it in the cloud, right? So let's do this again. Arch, we'll do CTCE, and I'm going to go ahead and create this library. So this will add that library to my list. Right here is that Revit content. And with that now, if I was to go into the CMS itself and refresh my libraries list, that library will appear here for me because I am an org admin. I always see all libraries 100% of the time. Now, this next little piece here, the step 2 of this, uploading a library image, something that I'm not going to do right now, gives you the ability to have sort of an image on top of, superimposed on top of your content. Where is that meaningful here? Well, over here in the CMS, let's kind of see where this manifests. Right here is an example. This basic table representation out of Civil 3D is in my AutoCAD Civil 3D content out of the box, and it has sort of the Civil 3D logo on it, so I can quickly just glance at it and identify what library is this content coming from. Just above that is a basic label for something, and I can see my CTC logo on here, the old legacy logo in this case. But if I mouse over this, I can actually see this is in 2 separate libraries, oddly enough, but I can quickly get an idea of where it's coming from. The first one is actually my corporate library here. There's a few other items inside of here, similar deal where they might be in more than one library, but they do exist inside of this environment, and I can see quickly with that little logo there where they're coming from. Another example to this might be if I'm searching for a bunch of content. Here's content I can tell you is coming directly from my MEP productivity pack that I'm subscribed to, and that is separate from my corporate content down here. And I can just, by looking at the icon, very rapidly identify where it's coming from. And this is superimposed over the top of the content itself. And that comes from this upload library image page right here. If you publish an image, that will get superimposed for you. So that's one setting that you can do. And you can change this later on. If you're like, oh, I forgot to do that, and I really want those images, fantastic. You can upload this image whenever you want. It's just limited to a 100K file size. And then once you upload that, after about an hour, that image will manifest on all of the tiles for all of the content that is in that library. So it's a good way to give your users some visual reference of what's going on. Now I'm going to ignore this one for right now and just click on next. I'm going to talk about permissioning this library. So for most of us, we're going to create a library and have its name, which in my case is Revit Content for Architecture, CTC Express Tools. And the next thing that we're going to do right away is go into permissions. Probably. We might skip that library image thing and just go directly to permissions. And within permissions here, this is where you can piggyback on the user and group organization that we talked about in a previous webinar that's already up on our channel. Now, users and groups are important because this is how users sign in, and it's also how you group them together into sort of teams of users or rights permissions of users. The most simplistic group to piggyback on or to leverage is the one that is by default called everyone. That group will exist for every organization, and everybody in your team will be in that group. So you don't have to actually do any active manual administration of it. And I'm going to use that group here. Well, actually, I'm not, because this is an architecture library, and I don't want everyone to have access to it. So what I'm going to do here, I made myself a group that is called DI, shortcut for Discipline, Architecture. It's a group that I custom made, and I have very specific people in it. Again, if you want to see about group creation, you can do that in another webinar that we have. But I'm going to use this group here to give these architecture users rights to see this library. Now here we have to talk about some of the roles that can exist. Libraries have sort of 4 roles. There's no role, meaning you can't see it at all. That's the default role for everybody. If you don't add them to the library, they have the no rights role on the library. But if you add them, there's actually 3 that you can actually select, and that is consumer, contributor, and manager. And so before I dig too deep into this, I do want to switch this and say we're now talking about controlling the access specifically to the library itself. And you can always change your mind on this in the future, but it's good to kind of have an idea starting out of what you want to do here. So for my discipline architecture group of users, I'm going to go over here to the role and talk through what these 3 access levels are when you assign it to the library. I'm going to start at the top end. Actually, I'll start at the bottom end and work my way up. So consumer. This means that an end user will see this library in their list of available libraries. It will show up for them, and they will be able to search all of the content in that library. And as the name indicates, consumer, they will be able to pull content from that library into their design space. They'll be able to use it, consume the content. If you go to the next tier up, a contributor, what this means is that they can contribute feedback to the library, to that piece of content in that library. So say something is broken, they can leave feedback saying, hey, when I insert this door into a wall, then it breaks when the wall is set up like that. Like, they can leave you some feedback so you as admins know what's going on. Or maybe they really like a piece of content. Maybe they want to share that, right? This is sort of a bit of a social space, sort of. They can rate the content. If it's really garbage, then they can give it like 1 star. Or if it's really good, they can give it 5 star. That's a contributor level role. Another contributor level role is that they can add to the tags associated to a piece of content or remove tagging from a piece of content as a contributor if you let that be a right that they can do. So that's the contributor level role. The final one here, the manager level role, this one allows them to actually add and remove content from this discrete library. So for the most part, usually when I'm adding a user group to a library, I'm usually choosing either consumer or contributor. And in this case, because this is the architecture library and these architecture users will be, consuming this content, I also want them to have contributor level feedback rights to it so they can tell me if something is wrong. They're going to be the daily users of it. This is a great place for them to tell me if something isn't working right. So I'm going to choose that role, and I'm going to click Add. Now, I am a part of the organization admin group. You'll notice I did not add myself here. I hadn't had any rights on here yet And still, I was seeing the library in my available list over here, Revit Content Arc. It already showed up for me because when I'm signed in here with my organization admin role, I have God level rights across the entire system, and I will see every single library. So I don't need to add myself. It's redundant to say, hey, take my organization admins and make them managers. That is unnecessary. You don't have to do that because you've already got that right. All right. Okay, so I'm going to click next on this. I'm just going to update this and finish it out. I'm done with that library setup. Let's take a look at a few other libraries that I have here with different kinds of rights that you might care about and why you might care about that. Now, I had mentioned standards and procedures. I had mentioned that I very intentionally have rights set up in a way that does not allow users to give me feedback. Let's go take a look at how I have this configured. So in my library details, I gave it a name, standards and procedures, and I can change this whenever I'd like to. I have a description on it as well. And I have my library set up to upload content. So my users, no matter where they are in the world, they can get access to my library. As long as they have the CMS installed, they can then review my standards and use that when they're working. It doesn't matter if they're connected via VPN to my network or not. They can just get access to my stuff. So that's how I have mine set up. I do have an image associated to this library. And so when anybody searches content that is in this library, they will see this as an overlaid preview image on top of that content. In the permissions area over here, you'll notice that I have everyone associated to this. So I've renamed my everyone group, and I talked about that when we did the user and groups session. But I renamed my group to R, everyone CTC Express Tools. R prefix for me is a role prefix. I chose that naming convention. But you'll notice here that the role that I gave them on this library is a consumer. I did not make them contributors. The last thing I need is having my users in my company reading through my standards and my procedures, and they start leaving me nasty gram comments and rating my standards as 1 star, saying, hey, when I worked for company XYZ, they did things this way. You know what? This is not the environment for that. So I've chosen to leave all of my users, everyone, as consumers of my standards and procedures content. So that's my choice of how I set this up. In my Revit content normal library, where all of my typical Revit content is, let's go through this one. So I have a name, I have a description for myself, I have upload content turned on again, I have a library image, similar image. In my permissions, I have everyone in my company set up as a contributor this time. This means if something is broken in this library, they can contribute back to me feedback about the content, saying, hey, this is broken and this is why, 1 star, your content is terrible. That's great, I can know that. I also have a team in my company that are CAD and BIM managers. Now, I don't want them to be organization admins across everything CTC, so I made a special group of people that are these CAD and BIM managers, and I made them a manager discreetly of this Revit content library. I did not make them managers, you might notice, of my standards and procedures library. That's different people who kind of run that. So you might want to do this where you've got managers of a certain library, meaning these CAD BIM managers can upload content, but they can't do things like changing the name of the library. That's fixed. I control that. They just get to manage the content within it, right? So you have a lot of rights controls on how your libraries function for different team members on your team. Let me see, anything else here? Yeah, let's take a look at my Dynamo library. The CMS, by the way, can host Dynamo scripts. It can host Dynamo content. And so in my permissions here, I have everyone once again set up as a contributor. Anybody can use or consume and run a Dynamo routine, and they can contribute their feedback if that routine is broken for some reason. Now, my BIM managers may or may not be really good Dynamo power users, but I do have a team in-house that is really good power users of Dynamo. And so I've made them a manager of this library so they can discreetly upload new Dynamo scripts or refine existing scripts if they get bad feedback about something because it's broken. They can manage this library discreetly, right? So this is how I have my environment set up. You might want to piggyback on this and use this very similarly for your environment, or you may want to expand upon it. There might be aspects of this you don't use. Maybe you're only Civil 3D and you're not doing anything Revit, or vice versa. You can pick and choose from this sort of framework, kind of how you want to build up your custom libraries for your organization. And then later on, subsequently, you start processing your content into those libraries. Now, I'm not going to talk about the processing of content today. That's a different webinar session. So, go ahead and take a look through our YouTube channel and look for those. But for now, unless there's any special questions, I'm going to start by saying thank you to all of you watching this up on the YouTubes. We hope you found this little micro session of managing your libraries meaningful. And we hope to see you in future CTC webinars and recordings as the rest of the series kind of flushes itself out.